Hello everyone and welcome to our wellness webinar with Vivian from our EAP provider. Vivian's got a lovely presentation about professional boundaries and time management in the context of self-care. So I'm going to hand over to Viv now. Thank you very much and I hope you enjoy.
Hi guys, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Yeah, so look, we'll take roughly an hour. It depends how involved you guys get, but I've probably got anywhere between 45 minutes and the next hour that we'll be working together and looking at professional boundaries and time management, because there's a lot of overlap between the two topics. And hopefully we'll put a real focus there on self-care and what it can do for you in terms of helping to protect you and keep you safe. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge country, the original custodians of this land that we're meeting on here today. And I found this lovely picture by Sheila Humphreys. I thought it was really nice. It's a picture of the Six Seasons, so I thought I would pop that onto the presentation to reflect the lovely land that we sit on. As usual, guys, just to touch on group agreement and just to make sure that we work together safely today and effectively. Just to remind people about the differing values and beliefs that we all bring into the experience today, and how different people may prefer to communicate, that we can all adapt and modify our own styles to try and include everybody else. Is there anything in particular that you think is important to include today outside of what's on there? Okay, and just a big reminder around confidentiality. If anybody does disclose anything about themselves or somebody that they're working with, if you could just remember to keep it just within this training session and not discuss it once you get outside, if that's okay. So moving along, expectations. Is there anything in particular anybody wants to get out of this workshop? Okay, well, if there is as we go along, guys, don't be afraid to jump in and ask a question. I'm pretty happy to be flexible and go with the flow. But basically, the kind of things that we'll be covering today, bear with me, I'm actually just going to move my, there we go, I'm popping you over to one side so I can see my slides. So we're going to be looking at professional boundaries in the context of the workplace, and just promoting your own self-care in particular as part of that experience. So just a reminder that a lot of this is designed to be interactive, guys. So when I throw out a question, just encourage you to jump in and get involved in the conversation. Otherwise, it's going to be me talking for the next hour, and that could get pretty boring. So what is a professional boundary? What are your thoughts?
Not to gossip.
Yeah, that'd be a pretty important one for sure, yeah. Any other thoughts, guys?
Keeping emotions out of your work, communications.
Yeah, and that's a really hard one, actually, isn't it? To keep your emotions out of the work, because we're not robots. So how do you do that in practice? So be really good to explore that one in more depth as we go along, for sure, particularly around self-care, because that's one of the main causes of vicarious trauma, is actually trying to separate, those emotions out. Anything else? Any other ideas about what a professional boundary actually is?
Not to get too close.
Yeah, because again, that's what helps to keep us safe, but also gives that professional relationship with the people that we're working with, so that we don't become friends, and that then in turn would lead to all sorts of complications. So if we looked up definitions of professional boundaries, it would probably look a little bit like this. It defines and separates your professional role from the other roles in your life, and it makes a distinction between your personal relationships and professional relationships. Okay, so if you've got pen and paper, to hand, guys, by any chance?
Yeah.
All right, so just take a couple of minutes there to think about why professional boundaries are important. Okay, any thoughts?
Yeah, I've actually got something. My name's Nita, just
Hi,
coming in
Nita.
late in. As I said,
Hello.
hi. Just dragged in, as I said, I had to duck off and get somebody at the front doors. It's one of those advantages of working from home, I guess, but disadvantages when it comes to work. With professional boundaries, I think it's very paramount, particularly if you're looking at somebody else's conversation. You need to make sure that you've actually assigned exactly what role you're playing in the conversation and the discussion. And it's got to be clearly articulated so that if you need to step away from it, you can do that with confidence and comfort, and also making sure the individual that you're actually talking to knows exactly what role you're playing and how you can actually support them if going forward.
Yeah, that's an awesome point to make. Absolutely, yeah. I think role is part of what helps people to understand what we do, why we're there, and the purpose of the relationship. Because without that, it gets really messy and blurry. Any other thoughts, guys?
Hi, it's Belinda here. I just think too, if you are too friendly with your managers, that it affects their ability to manage, and vice versa.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And also with clients, you've got to. I don't deal with clients myself, but you can overstep the boundaries with clients, and then you get into trouble, and you can get accused of things and stuff like that.
Yeah, so a lot of that is there for our own protection. Yeah, because if there's confusion about role or whether you're friends, and clients don't necessarily, even though you might explain it, they may not necessarily understand what the parameters of that looks like. And sometimes I think there's a confusion between friendliness and being a friend. And it can be hurtful sometimes to have to state that to somebody, but it's a really important aspect of working with people. Whoops, I skipped a slide. So so we need them to define effective and appropriate interaction between professionals and the people that we work with, but also within our workspaces. So like you pointed out there, with working with managers, but also within our teams and intercollegially with our colleagues, because otherwise things can get pretty messy. So how are boundaries established? So think about your personal boundaries, guys. What are your personal boundaries? And that's going to be so different from person to person.
Yeah, mine are based around the actual relationships that I have externally, like with family, for example, is very different to how I have a boundary with a friend. Is very different to how I deal with my own immediate family themselves. So, for example, my parents is very different how I talk to my brothers and sisters. And then again, my boundary is based around what I'm talking about to my son. And it comes down to the conversations we're talking about as well. I know that if I talk to my son about some gaming he has, it's a certain different conversation I'm having as to what I'd have with my mum and dad, because they don't understand gaming. but it's certainly just the relationships that you build and the actual individual relationships that I have formed over the years, depending on what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a really good point there, because it really depends on, as you said, the context, like what you're talking about, but also how you're feeling on the day. Because what I might be okay with one day, I might not be okay with the next. So they're constantly shifting and moving in terms of your own personal boundaries and what's okay and what's not. What about, how are boundaries established as professionals?
But me again.
Well,
Go for it.
Not unless somebody else wants to pop in there. No?
I'm happy
Okay.
to pop in, Nita.
Yep,
It's Elaine.
please do. Yep.
Hey, Elaine.
Hi there.
We just want you to take over the meeting, Nita.
See, I told you that's why I came in late.
I've lost the plot now. Look, I think you'll have different professional boundaries with people that you work with. So obviously, if it's your manager, you'll have a different set of interactions with them, and there might be some things that you're concerned about that may not be work related that you might share with friends in your team. So you'll have different communication styles dependent on the scenario and who you're speaking to, and similarly different boundaries if you're speaking with external stakeholders that you may have known in past positions, or you might be dealing with something super sensitive, that even having that past relationship, you'll always keep everything perfectly on track. Yeah.
Yeah, and that interagency stuff there and stakeholders, that brings up a whole other level of complication, or if you like, or things to be mindful of in terms of professional boundaries. So it's even down to the small things. So I know that when I'm emailing internally, it's all smiley faces and thumbs up. But when I'm emailing externally, suddenly you've got that professional face on, because you're aware, now I'm an ambassador for my organisation. So I have to be seen to be writing in a more formal way, but yet friendly. And I have to make sure that there's no typos. I have to make sure that I'm aware of all of the facts before I shoot off that email. So it looks very, very different, even in terms of how we communicate in an email, when you start bringing those factors into the play. Does that make sense? Do you guys share it? I'm sure most agencies share that similar informality internally. Do you guys share informally inside, or is it still kept very professional internally?
I think it just
depends on who I'm
depends.
talking to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, yeah, because it wouldn't be appropriate for me to email the general manager here with thumbs up emoji. I'm sure I'd be hauled into the office pretty quickly. But with perhaps one of my colleagues who I share a cup of coffee with every day, that's going to be a look very, very different.
Mm.
So the different areas that we can have issues with around boundaries are obviously organisationally, interagencies and with stakeholders, with clients, with or the people that we're working with the client's family and their community and anybody else who's engaged during that process on a personal level, and then collegially, interpersonally within the office. And I'm sure there's many more if we dig deep enough. Can anybody add to that list? Okay, well, if you think of any as we're going along, feel free to hop in and add to that list, because I'm sure it's quite a lengthy one. Sorry, this would be a good time. So, Jessica, do you have that video ready?
Yep, I'll just share my screen.
Awesome. Somebody's eating biscuits?
Yeah, they're my dogs. I've been feeding them on our dinner plates because it like spreads the food out a bit more, so that's what the sound is.
Nice.
All right. And I'm also eating my lunch too. Here we are. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Yep. Awesome.
Yes.
All right, here we go.
That is it. Jelly again. That's the third time he's done it. It wasn't even funny the first time.
Why has he done that?
Told him once that I don't like jelly. I don't trust the way it moves.
Yeah, you showed him a weakness. He pounced. You should know about that. Oh, what is it in there?
It's my stapler.
Well, don't do that. Well, eat it out. There's people starving in the world, which I hate. So, and it's a waste. So, how do you know it's yours?
Because it's got my name on it in Tipex.
Yeah, don't eat it now. In chemicals.
Right, you can be my witness. Give him an official warning.
How do you know it was me?
It's always you.
I do.
Can't you discipline him?
Oh, kinky. No, the thing about practical jokes is you've got to know when to stop as well as start, and now's the time to stop putting Gareth's personal possessions in jelly, alright?
Gareth, it's only a trifling matter.
Here we go. We're always like this.
You should put him in custody.
He's going to fit in here. We've got Vic and Bob, aren't we? And one extra one. Oh, God.
Yeah, I'm more worried, really, about damage to company property, that's all.
Trifling. I'm just trying to think of other desserts to do.
Yeah, it's all right here. But people do sometimes take advantage because it's so relaxed. You know, I like to have a laugh just as much as the next man. But this is a place of work. You know, I was in the Territorial Army for 3 years, and you can't muck about there. That's sort of one of the rules.
Hey, dude.
Give it back.
I'm just using it for a second.
It's got my name on it, Gareth.
Yeah, it says Garrett, actually, but...
Ask if you want to borrow it.
Hey, you always say no, mate. What's the point?
Perhaps that's where you should ask.
Gareth, it was just there, okay?
Yeah? That's his home. Leave it there.
Okay.
Philip, get that off him. Get that off him.
Stay where you are, okay? I'm going to let this go, right, unless you stop acting like a fool.
Well, you won't, so...
Well, I have, so...
What if that kills someone?
Oh, kills... well, they'll think you're the murderer. It's got your name on it.
Why would a murderer put his name on a murder weapon?
To stop people borrowing it.
David?
I hate the fact you bring me down to this. I really do. I
Don't know why you're laughing.
Well, leave her out of it. Well done. You carry on. Listen, you bring me down to this, mate.
Okay. Ooh, that was a funny noise.
That was my
Oh, was it?
Yeah, he's just finished eating. Okay, thanks, Viv. All over to you.
Okay. So my PowerPoint's back up there again?
No, I think you'll need to share your screen again.
Okay, that's okay.
Nothing else. I love that show. It's brilliant. How unpolitically correct, incorrect, I should say.
Very much so, yeah. Hang on, what does this say? Can you see my slides?
No.
Oh.
You got a dual screen and you haven't clicked on the right screen?
No, it's just blank.
There may be a bit of a lag, like there was the first time.
Okay, I'll press stop sharing and I'll start again. Share screen. Scrolling down. Clicked it. Anything?
No.
It says you're sharing a presentation, but yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Ah, yes. Yes, I know.
Okay. So in the context of that video, obviously that's extremely politically incorrect, and there's any number of breaches happening there. So yeah, just off the top of your heads, actually, what breaches of boundaries did you notice in that clip?
The relationships between the boss and the actual employees. It's more a game than everybody else. the inappropriate sharing and destruction of a person's property,
Yeah.
not actually having a good relationship internally. Yeah, that'll do me for a start. Let somebody else have a.
Anybody else notice any?
Disrupting the whole office, even danger with the threat of throwing the stapler out the window.
Yeah. Anything else? And there probably was a breach of boundaries or a blurring of boundaries with the manager who I'm pretty sure must have had policies and procedures in place in terms of giving somebody a verbal warning if they did behave in that way and he didn't follow through. Yeah, and yeah, and there was probably a bullying and harassment complaint in there somewhere, so they would have breached their own policies and procedures around that, I'm pretty sure. And we could probably keep going on and on and on. So, I mean, some of those were pretty extreme, and you're not always going to get them as obvious that in the workplace. But what are some of the examples of how somebody can breach boundaries with colleagues within their teams or within shared spaces? And a lot of the time it's accidental, it's not intentional. But can you think of any examples?
It's actually not having clear indications between you and you and the employer, and or both the other way. And also it's about what you're saying as well. So you might actually have something that's okay to say in your own home environment, but not when you're actually speaking within a work environment. For example, when you've actually got dirty jokes and stuff like that, and you're not considering other people in the same space that you're in.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah. And there's so many implications with that. It doesn't come across as being professional, and if you let your guard down, if you like, or the boundary slip there, where do you stop? You know, and that's the problem with that. But also, I was doing a presentation the other day on family and domestic violence in the workplace, and if you're using smutty humour, you don't know who that's going to trigger, for example. What's that going to bring up for somebody? You never really know what's going on for other people. Yeah, so there's a range of reasons why humour in particular is one of those ones that can seem like it's a bonding exercise, but if it's taken too far, you can inadvertently actually end up, you know, probably from a conduct or professional conduct point of view, end up breaching a boundary for sure. Any other examples, guys?
I think you need to be mindful of people's personal boundaries as well, not get too close to people or a bit too touchy-feely, because it can be inappropriate.
Yes.
Cause some triggers.
Yeah, so can you give me examples of how you might touch somebody in the workplace, and it might not even be an intentional thing, but it's clearly perhaps not professional boundaries in place?
Employee putting his hand on the smaller woman's back, or hugging, or the old shoulder hug. Just depends, really.
Yeah, and I think the hugging one is fairly common, you know, and a lot of the time it's because workplace relationships, people do become friendly. And again, it's that slipping of that kind of moving between being friendly and now being friends. And outside of work, we hug our friends, so therefore it feels like a natural thing to do in the workplace if you feel friendly towards somebody or have even become friends over time. But it's learning to separate, you know, what's okay outside of work versus what's okay inside of work. Yeah.
Just the whole sort of after work get-togethers and Christmas parties can be fraught with danger.
Oh yes. What's the issue with meeting up outside of work with somebody you've become friends with from inside the workplace? What could you end up blurring boundaries around?
As I said, it all comes down to the relationship that you hold with the individual. Again, you've got to define the boundaries between what's okay at work and what's not okay at work, and what's okay in the privacy of your own home or wherever you're at. So you need to be clear on that. And your friends, as I said, both of you need to appreciate that. So I guess when it comes down to it, I'll give you a personal boundary for myself. I'm not a hugger, and I don't do it at work. So as I said, everybody take note of that, did they?
Mm.
So I usually step away from that. Even if it's on the social boundaries, I really have to have that relationship, a strong relationship, before that'll occur. But I'm clear on that. I will actually come up front and say, no, that's enough, hands up or something, shake my hand, and that's enough. So it's actually identifying what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, that's great that you're really clear about what your boundaries are. So it makes it a lot easier. And of course, with COVID-19 now, it definitely wouldn't be appropriate to hug.
Mm.
But I'll often get people trying to bump elbows with me. And it's not something I'm terribly comfortable with. So yeah, it's funny how sometimes you can even go along with something just because it's the expected thing, but yet not feel quite okay about it. So it's really important to get clear on what's okay and what's not okay for you personally and be comfortable communicating that. So going back to breaches in the workplace that potentially can happen, is also recognised, particularly that being friends outside of work. What do you think is going to happen if two colleagues meet up outside work in their personal time? What do you think they're going to be talking about?
I think they'll pretty much talk about personal things, really, and where it will work is where they can make a split. So it's professional at work and personal outside of work.
And look, if somebody can keep those really good boundaries, then that's amazing. But from a lot of people that I've spoken to, the tendency is that they slip into what's been happening. Yeah, work mode.
Yeah.
And the real reason that I think that that's a real issue for people is because essentially you're doing overtime now. You're back talking about work. And in terms of self-care, it's really, really important to take space in between when you clock off work and when you clock on work the next day. So if during your downtime you're actually still talking about work, even though it might be in a humoursome way, the bottom line is you're still actually focused on work, and it means that your mind is still active and thinking about issues to do with work. So other breaches could be even things about how somebody might sit beside you in the work space. It could be even noise. Have you ever noticed some people have a very loud voice? Somebody's giggling.
Me again.
Yeah.
Go on. What's popped into your head?
Nita's very loud.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
she is. Yes, you can hear me, and I don't even have to have a microphone from here.
Okay. So
I think
sometimes,
confidentiality as well.
for sure. Yeah. How could that happen? Anyone got
If you're
examples?
talking about something that's not across something, and then you're breaching the confidentiality of, a project or something that you're on.
Yeah, and a classic example of that is debriefing. In the workplace, debriefing tends to happen when somebody feels that maybe they've, been working with somebody and it's been a difficult session, or whatever that might be. And the most natural thing in the world is to come back and debrief with one of your colleagues. Can you see how there might be breaches of boundaries around that? Potentially.
Yeah, there definitely would be, particularly if you've got an employer, if your boss is actually the one that you're sort of having a conversation with, then you're actually going to go back to work. And as I said, stuff that may be happening about the person that's sitting next to you. As I said, there's certainly some boundaries, blurred boundaries there, and you've certainly got to make sure it's clear and you don't have those sorts of conversations, because neither of you want to be in that position.
No, for sure. And one of the other reasons why it's really important to think about who you're debriefing with is how does it affect them? So when we think about time management in the workplace, when somebody's got their head down and they're on task and they're focused and maybe they've got some deadlines, but we're going with how we feel and what we need right now, we're not necessarily considering how is that actually impacting the other person. Is this a good time for them, for example? How much time am I taking to debrief? Am I being pretty concise, getting to the point and agreeing with the person before we do it? What's a reasonable amount of time for me to debrief? Is that the appropriate person to debrief with? Thinking about sometimes there's people who work with different family members from the same family. So therefore, you've got, you know, that if you like, that confidentiality that you need to keep within families. You know, or you might have an issue with, you know, making sure that you're not disclosing names, making the person non-identifiable and things like that. I mean, most organisations are pretty savvy about reminding people about using non-identifying language, but sometimes because it's in the office, we relax the guard and can get a bit more informal about it. So it's just remembering to still keep that non-identifying language, but in particular thinking about your colleague, you know, is it a good time for them, remembering to ask and agreeing in advance, you know, what's a reasonable amount of time to spend talking about this, because I mean, I know I've certainly seen colleagues who spent up to an hour debriefing, and if that's happening 2-3 times a week, that's a huge chunk out of somebody's day, and it can also be very draining. Perhaps that's that person's downtime. And you've just ad hoc grabbed them and said, hey, I need to share. So just being aware of, you know, your volume, how does that affect people around you? You know, when you need to get the head down and get on with work, how do you let your colleagues know that actually you need some quiet time right now, so that you're not being drawn into banter or distracted, for example, or emails, even emails, getting unnecessary emails. Anybody here receive unnecessary emails?
A bucket load every day.
Yeah, yeah. So the ones that you're CC'd into just because it's a matter of course. So just remembering, you know, is it relevant to the person? Do they really need to receive this email? You know, and just thinking twice about that. And in terms of communicating really good workplace boundaries, if you are receiving boundaries that are not necessary, don't be afraid to reach out to the person and politely let them know, actually, this is an example of the kind of email I don't need to receive, and it will save you the time of effort including me in. Yeah, and a lot of the time it's because people are unsure or uncertain, so they just CC every man and his dog in just to be on the safe side. Does that make sense? And I'm sure we could think of a million more examples about inadvertently blurring boundaries in our shared spaces. So, the slide decided to pause. Yeah, here's other examples: working in small teams, negotiating friends versus work colleague, personal spaces, you know, touching and hugging and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think we covered most of those. So what about client and worker boundaries? What's the preferred word that you guys like to use for the people that you work with? Just so I'm using appropriate language.
I think it's okay to use those, because that's what
Okay.
we have. Our workplace is exactly what that is, and our clients is who we actually deal with. So, and
Okay,
that
I was
could be
just
anybody, a
checking.
client. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I just said I wasn't terribly sure, so I said I better check. So what are some examples of breaches that might be made, or blurring of boundaries that might be made within the context of a client and worker and their families? And that can go 3 different ways. That can be in relation to how the worker is with the client, in other words, the worker blurring the boundaries, or it could be the other way around, where the client is blurring the boundaries towards the worker, or perhaps the worker blurring the boundaries towards the families of the person that they're working with. So just take about 5 minutes to write down as many examples as you can think of for that 3-way dynamic. Okay, guys, any examples?
Yep, I've got a few.
Go for it.
This is me again.
Yeah.
All right, so a couple of examples would be personal space, being identifying between what all that is, the roles of each individual party, clear guidelines of the task and why I'm there, clear communication, my rights and the expectations, what is allowed and what's not, and who to talk to if I have an issue.
Awesome, yeah, great. Any other examples, guys?
Yeah, I think it's being mindful of their role and who you should talk to and your role in that. And even as simple as thinking about when you make a phone call or send an email, to think about time zones and how it might affect them in business hours. And also, you know, rather than send a great big long email, maybe it's easier to pick up the phone, things like that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's just basic respect and consideration. Where do you think there could be a possible breach in terms of, in particular, say the client towards the worker that could cause a problem for you in your self-care?
Could be based around touch and actually the words spoken.
What kind of words?
As I said, if you're going to call me a dickhead, don't say you mean it. I could be a little bit more explicit, but it's actually being respective of actually the conversation that's being had. And, you know, there could be a religious boundaries in there that you've got to consider, and it could be based around whether you've actually got a female carer in and you're looking after a male who may have some mental conditions as well that need to be factored in. And there could be, I guess, they're inappropriate arrangements or things that are done in the actual party's concern. So it's a whole range of things that need to be considered, and you need to be, as an individual, you need to be aware of that and comfortable with that. And if you're going to come home with a bad thought in your brain, you need to be able to offload that.
For sure. And what about your time? So I'll come back to it in a second, but what happens if something happens with a client when you're out and about, or perhaps sometimes you've got an overly talkative client and you know, they really enjoy that company when you're there with them and they're trying to extend the session. What do you think is going to happen as a consequence of that?
Or you'll probably end up being late for the next client, and then you'll say to the next client, oh, I'm so sorry I was late. Vivian wanted me to stay and have a cup of tea, and she's so lonely, you know, and our son doesn't visit often enough. And before you know it, you're down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
And in turn, that's going to lead to burnout and high levels of stress because you're not you're not pacing yourself. And that's really, really important, because that 5 minutes, factoring that in between each appointment or however long you factor in is really what helps you to kind of manage your own well-being as part of it. What about receiving gifts from clients?
No, that's what I don't consider to be an appropriate function, only because, again, that hasn't defined the boundaries. You are there for a role. If they want to treat you as a family, that's a personal relationship. You don't do that during the work hours. If you as I said, you've got to be mindful, again, and aware of the boundaries and the role that you play. As we know, we've got staff that are actually, we do our job well and we do it very well. And we've got some people out there that love us dearly, but we've also got a role to play.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's a list of professional boundary violations is the word that's written there, but some of them are not necessarily violations. They're like a tweaking of the boundaries, or sometimes a blurring of the boundaries, but they can very quickly turn into an actual breach. Where is it appropriate to use self-disclosure, do you think?
I would actually look at doing that one, as I said, if I've got something to discuss, I'll be taking it away from the conversation I'm having with the client, if that's where I'm at, and I've got something I need to offload. and I probably would find some sort of, whether it's my boss, that I'd actually be having a private conversation, or I may even consider going through EAP if it's actually something that's actually causing more stress to me individually.
Yeah. So what about your own emotional reactions? Now this one is the trickiest one. And look, let's be honest about it, guys. Not everybody that we work with we like. Although we might try to be person-centred and non-judgmental and empathic, occasionally there's going to be that one person that you're working with that perhaps you find it a little bit more difficult to like, particularly if they're calling you names like you shared earlier on, or maybe you find that amusing, I don't know. So, you know, how do we make sure that we're keeping really good boundaries around our own emotional reactions, you know, particularly for clients that we're working with?
I think if you are experiencing challenges while you're out in the client's home that distress you in any way, shape or form, you should be able to make contact with your line manager. It might be that you're not the best fit for that client, because certainly over a sustained period, language and behaviour can have a really bad effect on staff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree, yeah, because sometimes we're just not the right person to work with somebody, and it's knowing that and being professional enough to come forward and say, I'm not the right person, and having that conversation. So think about your own personal boundaries, guys. Can you recall a time when your boundaries were pushed or broken? How did you feel? And was it a physical boundary, a verbal boundary, or an emotional boundary, or perhaps some other kind of boundary?
I personally find that I've actually got a reasonable grasp on this. Again, it comes down to who I'm having a conversation with. I guess in one of my other roles, I'm also a peer support officer for emergency services. So this is something I've got to be very clear about. And I actually bring that with me to work. And I hope that I've actually portrayed that when I'm actually with all my colleagues at work as well. And if I'm going to go around calling you Chicky Babe, it's not because it's a bad thing. But there are certain people that I would not do that to, and I make sure that I have a professional stance and a position. And as I said, I've also got to be in the right frame of mind if I'm going to have a conversation as well.
So does anybody else have a time when they recall that somebody pushed their boundaries? And look, even if you are clear on your boundaries, it doesn't mean other people won't try it on. You know, so can anybody recall, you know, whether it was a colleague or a manager or another agency or a family member, as in family of the person that you were working with or a client, who pushed the boundaries, and how it made you feel?
It just makes you feel uncomfortable. So, and I suppose you then think about it afterwards and, oh, maybe I should have handled that differently. So, like, sometimes you're just taken by surprise, so you don't really know how to deal with it at the particular time.
Yeah, it's tricky. Yeah, and I think that's I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Is when you get caught blindsided, you're not always prepared. So even though afterwards you can reflect back and say, oh, this is how I could have responded instead, when you get caught on the hop, you're often, you know, you find you're not quite ready or prepared in how to respond in the best way. You know, I know, for example, my own personal experience, I had a manager who constantly blurred the boundaries and wanted to become friends outside of work, but I just didn't feel it was appropriate. And it used to make me feel very uncomfortable over the time that I worked there, and it was one of the reasons that I actually left. So, you know, that those boundaries can be pushed in many different roles and in different ways. And verbally, of course, like you're saying, sometimes that use of language, what's okay to one person might not be okay to the next. So the first lady there, I can't remember your name, sorry, what was your name? Who's very clear on her boundaries, what's your name? Nita, yeah. So the way you were describing there, you know, it's really great when you're really clear on boundaries and you know exactly what they are, because then you're less likely to get caught blindsided. And that's why it's so important as part of self-care to actually prepare yourself for those scenarios or situations, so you know in advance you know, what to say or what to do in those situations.
Yep.
So what's in it for me? Can you think of anything else that might be in it for you if you keep those boundaries?
I think it's a way of protecting yourself in a way and keeping yourself safe. I think you'll always meet different personalities. You know, we've all come from different boundaries and different upbringings and what have you. So I use a term, metaphorically speaking, I cut the umbilical cord. You know, if I'm in a situation with someone very challenging, I just, you know, separate my emotion and just be consistent with them.
Like that, it's a good metaphor. Yeah. I presume you guys are all familiar with vicarious trauma and burnout and the signs and symptoms of that? Or am
Yeah.
I making... Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
that's fine.
as I said, my other
Yeah, been
lives
there,
actually.
done that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. Just making sure.
Yeah.
So managing boundaries with time, what are common blurring of boundaries around time that occur in the workplace, do you think?
Being at home and having deadlines that, you know, having really tight deadlines, like for us for end of financial year, and because you're home, you'll do your full time of work and then you'll go and have dinner or something, and then you come back and do another few hours, and before you know it's midnight, and then you go to sleep and you start to do the same the next day. So
Yep, that would definitely be a blurring.
yep, so that's that's kind of end of financial year, unfortunately. So, and that's
Yeah.
something that's a trap that you have to stop yourself falling into.
I recommend that highly. Anybody else got examples?
Yeah, mine's because of my other lives. Hang on. As I said, I'm an emergency services volunteer, so I could actually be called out to a high-risk situation. So as I said, if I've been at work for a long period of time and then I'm actually going to go out and do another shift, and I mean a shift could be anything to 12 to 18 hours, and then have the expectation to come back to work again, I'm no good to anybody. So I certainly make sure that I've got a time between, and particularly if I've got somebody else to consider in that relationship as well, I make sure that they know that I've actually, I'm exhausted and I'm no good to them, and I need to have that break, and then I can come back.
Awesome, yeah, I love that. Yeah, because I think sometimes we underestimate what we're juggling outside of work. And some people, you know, they need to work 2 or 3 jobs, or perhaps they're contracted to different agencies. And if you're not managing your downtime properly, you know, it's only a matter of time before the cracks are going to appear. Like you said, you're no good to anybody if that happens, yeah. And your family will suffer as well because you won't be there for them either. Any other thoughts around where there's blurring of boundaries around time in the workplace, guys?
I think
When you have the conversation.
Sorry?
When you have the conversation.
What do you mean?
Well,
yes.
Yes, yeah. So as I said, you've got to pick the right time for that conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I mean, I've dot pointed a few there, but honestly, I think we could probably write a list of 100 and come up with 100 more. But the most common ones are working longer hours than you've been rostered for. In other words, you're supposed to clock off at 5. I'll just send out these last few emails. It might only be 20 minutes. You know, I'll just stay with that client. They're not in the best space. She wants me to stay 10 more minutes. Or it could be work until midnight because the financial returns are due or whatever it is. But when you think about it, that's your valuable time. You know, if you're giving up that time, you know, that's easy. If that habit begins to develop over time, before you know it, instead of being, you know, paid to work an 8-hour day, suddenly you're working a 9-hour day, and you didn't sign up for that, number one. But number two, you began to blur the boundaries between your own personal space and your family, the people who are most important to you, and your work. You know, and it often comes from a good place, but sooner or later it begins to, you know, result in negative side effects like burnout. And it's just one to watch out for. If it's clock off time, it's clock off time. So unless it's been approved by a manager and there's been discussion about why that needs to happen, it's probably not a good idea to get into that habit. Taking homework that's not approved. You know, I often see that in workplaces when I was working in clinical supervision. Somebody would take the work home because they felt that they wouldn't get it finished before the deadline, so they would just take it home and spend their evening doing it there instead. Again, the same thing applies. It's only a matter of time before the cracks are going to appear. You know, and it's not best practice. Thinking about work when you're not in work. Now, this one's an interesting one. So technically you're not physically doing any work, but if you're thinking about work, surely that's the same thing as being in work. Is anybody here guilty of thinking about work when they're not in work?
Every day.
Okay, so just think about it, the importance of your downtime. And if you're thinking about work, who's most important to you and what's most important to you? You don't have to say it out loud, but just reflect for a second. Who is most important to you? And just ask yourself, every minute that you spend in thinking about work when you're actually at home, is that taking from time you could be thinking and being present with the people who are most important to you, or perhaps doing the things that are most important to you? That downtime, you know, whether it's, I don't know, going fishing or whatever it is you love to do. So out of all of them, this is the one that's the thief of your time, is actually because there's nobody in your head to monitor that. So I really encourage people to put really good boundaries around only thinking about when you're actually physically in work. Spending more time with a client than you were scheduled to. You gave examples of that earlier on, how that could happen. And the rabbit hole that you then end up falling down. Not allowing adequate time for breaks. So again, when people are under the pump, I see it all the time, and I'm guilty of it myself on occasion, grabbing, you know, a sandwich or something and sitting in front of the computer and working through their lunch break. A, you're not being paid for that, probably, but B, you're not getting adequate downtime. Your brain needs a break, you know, so that you can re-energise and refresh. Eating lunch whilst working and no proper downtime. Not prioritising the important thing first, so the unimportant things get done, but always have a sense of not getting ahead. Did you ever see that jar of stones or rocks? Did you ever see that activity?
Yes, I've seen that.
For anybody who hasn't, I recommend you Google it. If I find a link, I'll send it to you. It's really, really good. It shows a teacher putting with a jar of rocks full to the brim, and he asks the students, is the jar full? And the students all say yes. And he produces then a bag of small pebbles and pours them in around the rocks so that more fits in. So again, he says to the students, now is the jar full? And all the students say, yes, yes, it is. So then he produces a bag of sand, and then he pours the sand in between the pebbles and the rocks, and of course that then fills to the top, and he says to the students, now is the jar full? Okay, the students are starting to learn, and they're hesitant about this one. They say, no. And he said, that's right, it's not full. So then he pulls out a jug of water and he pours it into the jar until all the sand has absorbed the water. So then he asked the students, what's the purpose of that activity? What would you say? So I'm throwing it out to you.
It was related to the balance of your life. So some of those rocks might represent work time. The sand might represent the family. You know, it's having a work-life balance, life basically. Yeah.
Okay, and when you must have seen a slightly different version of it to me. The one I saw was actually around managing time and how valuable your time is. And the point he made was he put the biggest rocks in first. If he'd done it the other way around and started with the water, followed by the sand, followed by the pebbles, the rocks would not have actually been able to fit into the jar. And that's why you were saying the importance of actually prioritising and putting, if you like, the most important things first, or the things that need your attention most first, rather than, and it's quite common, we get distracted in the workplace, you know, the ping of the email popping up every 2 minutes with really things that are not that actually important. And, you know, I'm the queen of checklists, and I'll feel a great sense of satisfaction at the end of the day if I've crossed 90% of the things off my list. But after seeing that, I had a realisation that I might have been getting through a lot of things, but they weren't necessarily the most important things. So I was entering into the next day with that sense of burden on me still, because I hadn't actually prioritised, if that makes sense. And of course, the other thing then is allowing yourself to become distracted. And look, that can be social, you know, just chit chat, having a laugh. With colleagues, you know, getting distracted with, you know, stuff that isn't even yours, trying to be helpful. And it's just being aware, if you're finding it hard to get through your workload, or you have a sense of feeling overwhelmed, it might be trying to put really good boundaries around that. You know, you can't help others if you're not able to help yourself. And you're not going to be any benefit to the people that you're supporting, your clients, if that you work with, if you're not prioritising and putting really good boundaries in place. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with a time management matrix. Have you seen this before? If you haven't, it's a really good tool to use. You can get blank ones online. You can just go into Google Map Images and it'll give you blank ones, but it helps you to spread it into a quadrant so that you're prioritising your time based on what's important down to what's least important, and how you can get through it more efficiently during the day and escape, you know, some of those time wasting traps. So professional boundaries, why are they important in our work? I think you've pretty much identified all of these things already. And, you know, just to remember, you know, how are they established? It comes from our ethics, our workplace policies and procedures, legislation, lots and lots of research behind those, so that we are, you know, incorporating you know, best practice standards, but also personal responsibility. We have a personal responsibility to make sure that professional boundaries are established, and the things that guide us are there, but ultimately it's our responsibility to make sure that we implement it. So why do you think they're complicated? You know, so are they always black and white? As you've identified already, that friendliness or informality can sometimes get in the way. We can be over-empathising perhaps with somebody that we're supporting. A lack of assertiveness or wanting to be liked means you might say yes to that extra you know, client that you've been asked to take on, or perhaps, you know, debriefing with a colleague when really you've got you know, a mountain of stuff on your own desk or whatever it is. So just be aware of, you know, what are the things that might make you say yes when you really mean no. You might have concerns about complaints, you know, or you know, perhaps the cross-cultural boundaries within your community could be an issue, or when working in a small town. And I'm sure there's dozens of others, but they're just some very common ones there. So again, we've been through the consequences of loose professional boundaries. The most important part in that, of course, is yourself. If you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of anybody else. So self-care and making sure you bring it into supervision or line management, or wherever it is you get your support. And take stock of what's on your plate. Ask for help if you need it. Make sure that you're finding time to rebalance outside of your work. I can't emphasise that strongly enough. And in particular in your thoughts, that you switch that off and keep it switched off. And take home messages, just review of that. And thank you very much. We've come to the end of this reference. Check in, is everybody okay? Any comments or thoughts before we close the session?
I'm just going to stop the recording now. Thanks, Viv. And then you can ask questions. Sorry, guys.